Before we get started, can we get a round of applause for the staff? Help us out here. We have Absent State Productions recording the panel in the back. Welcome. Absolutely.
Local?
No, maybe fluent from Nashville.
You know, some folks.
I came down from Chicago.
Excellent. Excellent. Ooh, I think yes. All right. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Test.
Okay. Test. We good? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Alrighty. Welcome, welcome all. Dark History and Horror Convention. How are you all feeling?
Good.
Your caffeine may haven't kicked in, but we'll get you excited. So, my colleagues and I are just up the road a little bit at Illinois State University. I am Dr. Eric Wesselmann. I'm a social psychologist and the moderator of the panel. I study many things, but I'm a lifelong horror fan. And this question of why we love horror, I have been asking myself that for years and still don't have a good answer. So I've started to do some research and teaching on it. I've organized some colleagues here who are also horror fans, and we have similar and different takes on that. We're going to throw those out for you today. Let's first get to know some folks. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, so tell them who you are, a little bit about your interests, and then you can answer one of two questions, your choice.
Yeah.
Either your favorite horror film, or if you can't just pick one, then you can tell me your first horror memory.
Okay, excellent. Morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scott, a cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. Absolutely thrilled to be here. Lifelong horror fan. Growing up in the 60s and the 70s, when Creature Features was where you got your horror, there was no streaming. I would ask my parents if I could stay up by myself to watch Creature Features at 2 in the morning. My memory is watching Dracula, the Bela Lugosi's Dracula with my two brothers. My parents were gone for the weekend, and we argued over whether we were going to watch Dracula or How I Learned to Love the Bomb. Right? Those were the two movies that were on at that time. And I begged them to let me watch Dracula. And so they let me watch Dracula, and after 3 minutes, I screamed, "Please turn it off." It was so terrifying. So, absolutely thrilled to be here today.
Hey everyone, my name is Li Zeng. I'm film studies, associate professor of film studies at Illinois State University, actually in the Department of Theater and Dance. And so I teach horror. I teach film studies, including horror genre and film noir. Actually, this semester I'm teaching horror genre film. And so I'm originally from China. I came to the United States in 2002. Came to Illinois State 2007, and then since then I have been teaching film studies there. Yeah, definitely my way of discovering horror. It's a long journey, and later I will talk about that. So, but for the brief introduction, I would just say answer the question of favorite horror film. It's hard for me to just pick one because I have so many favorite subgenres. So probably it makes sense to say favorite film in particular subgenres. But just to pick one, just to make it simple, I think I'm wearing the T-shirt from Nosferatu. So I will just say never be a wrong answer to say one of my favorite films is Nosferatu. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both. I also cannot pick just one, but one of my most salient horror memories, I would say, is child of the 80s, watched a lot of the 80s slasher films much earlier than I probably should have. But the one that really stuck with me and gave me nightmares was Nightmare on Elm Street. But I just couldn't, it was this sort of weird, like, push-pull, morbid attraction, where I couldn't get it out of my head. And I think I got in trouble maybe about second grade in creative writing class because I decided to write a Freddy story. And my teacher thought that was inappropriate. So, but look where we are now.
Absolutely.
So what I've done is I'm going to ask each of my colleagues a couple questions. We've got some slides on the way that we are thinking of horror. I'll ask each of them a question, starting with myself, ask myself a question. Talk for a few minutes, then we'll riff as a panel. After we get through all the panelists, towards the end, we'll open it up to audience for questions as well. So, one of the ways that I think about horror that's interesting to me is the research on affect or emotion, right? So, you know, horror entertainment, right, is a genre that sort of the whole purpose of it is to evoke negative emotions, disgust, suspense, fear, and dread, things that in our everyday lives we usually try to avoid. So why do we, some of us, enjoy having those emotions evoked? And one interesting, when you talk to a lot of horror creators or listen to commentaries, interviews, a lot of the horror creators will talk about horror films like haunted houses as roller coaster rides, right? So you get that tenseness, that high physiological arousal. You know, your heart starts beating really, really fast, breathing heavy, you start to sweat a little. You get scared, and you go down the hill and suddenly it becomes fun and those screams turn to laughter, right? And there are horror theorists, both in the more art critique area as well as psychologists who study this, who are interested in that interplay between positive physiological arousal and negative, right? And how they bleed over into each other, pun intended. So if we look at, we can classify emotions on two basic dimensions, right? How much physiological arousal we have, very, very high, very, very low and chill, and then is the sort of valence of that emotion positive or negative? And so in this case, right, a high physiological arousal, negative emotion would be terror. High arousal, positive emotion is excitement. And arousal, once again, is relatively undifferentiated, right? So these things can work together such that the more scared I am when a joke happens, particularly in horror humor hybrid stories, that joke is funnier, and vice versa, right? And so there's a great study that shows how, particularly in ambiguous situations, we can sometimes mistake what our arousal means. So a couple researchers in the 70s who were interested in emotions on attraction, right, particularly physiological arousal, they had participants come out to a local park that happened to fortunately have two bridges. One was this sort of high, rickety, shaky bridge, and the other one was one that was a little more stable. And they said, okay, if we have participants go over the sort of high, rickety bridge, they're going to be a little bit more nervous, a little bit more keyed up than someone who goes across the safe bridge. So they had these participants, they scheduled them randomly, meet a research assistant. These were all heterosexual cisgender men, and the research assistant was a heterosexual cisgender woman. Moderate attractiveness, they pilot tested. They didn't want her to be too attractive or too unattractive because they wanted to see if physiological arousal would influence how attractive these men found her. So she met him on the bridge, gave him a bogus survey, questions that the researchers honestly didn't care about. What they were interested in, though, was at the end, she says to the participants, here's my number. If you have any questions about this study, please give me a call. And the researchers were like, well, how many of these men are going to call her? And is that going to differ by the bridge? And lo and behold, it did. The men who met her on the high bridge, 2 or 3 times more likely to call her than the men on the low arousal bridge. And usually they didn't even try to have formalities of asking about the study, they just asked her out. So, and there have been researchers who have looked at media and arousal, who have sort of looked at the context of horror films as good date movies from this general perspective, right? Go to a movie with someone that's your date, presumably you're attracted to them in some way. That scare comes up. They're suddenly a lot more attracted to you then than they were afterwards. There's actually another study, it's one of my favorites, where they had researchers stand outside of theaters, ones that were either action films, romantic comedies, or horror films, and they measured how many people were holding hands afterwards versus not, and they found that people were much more likely to hold hands after seeing a horror film than even the romantic comedies. All right, so that's kind of how I like to look at horror, is that arousal component. What do my esteemed colleagues think?
That's just so interesting. Like, okay, can we follow up with what you just talked about? Yeah, I mean, I was not aware the effect of after watching the horror than compared to the romance comedy. I find that so interesting. Like, the effect of after watching horror is actually make people and want to, I mean, more connect. It's just the more trusting and to each other. So I really like this aspect. For me, in terms of is that me talking about why I enjoy horror? Or
No, we're just going to riff on this.
Yeah. So I enjoy so that's immediately come to me is the effect of a horror genre.
Yeah, what I appreciate about your images is they're all social, right? And so, yes, some of us do watch horror movies alone, you know. At the same time, if we look at what it would mean to be a bunch of cave persons sitting around a cave, sitting around the fire, sharing shared anxiety, what that does is reaffirm that we're together, right? And it creates an other that's not us, that solidifies our group identity. So there are these after effects that are social. At the same time, it is a social phenomenon from the beginning. And I think that's absolutely fabulous. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mean, when we are together, right, there's a lot of people who study collective experiences, whether we're talking about movies, concerts, etc., and what does moving together, singing together, how it bonds us. And what's interesting is we can also, our emotions can sort of contaminate each other.
Oh, yeah.
Emotional contagion, right? So there's a reason why we laugh at them, but the laugh tracks in those old sitcoms,
yes,
canned laughter is there, and it does make people laugh a little bit more.
And when people can behave at a theater, right?
Yes,
When
yeah.
people can actually be there and watch the movie together and not be on their phones. I remember when you and I went to see It.
I was gonna do.
And there's this great scene where one of the protagonists does something really bad to the bad guy, and one of the audience members say, "Take that!" And the audience just burst out laughing. It was that arousal switch you talked about, right? That togetherness you can get with 4 or 5 people at home, but rocking it in the theater and everybody screaming it at the same time, it's really a campfire phenomenon. It's really.
All right, well, let's, Lee, I know that you teach horror regularly, and you teach horror films from a variety of different cultural contexts, right? So let's talk a little bit about your perspective on how there's this sort of interesting dynamic between what we all share as humans and what scares us, but how there's also a cultural emergence.
This also tied a little bit to my personal interest in horror is particularly the cultural aspect of horror. And if you ask the question of why horror, why people enjoy horror, why people in different cultures enjoy different type of horror. So that kind of question really fascinated me as a film scholar. So because my background is from China, so Asian cultures, and before I came to the United States, so most of the horror films I watched were made in Asian countries, and a lot of ghost stories. And so came to the United States to watch more about horror genre and particularly slasher genres, which was a very new experience for me, and just to know that there are different traditions of horror aesthetic. And so when I teach horror film, I usually, my focus is still, because my audience is students, meaning American-born students. So focus is American produced horror. I do have a few weeks focused on like European, just have shown a little bit European film, horror film, and also Asian horror film. One thing is, I think, what is universal, because when we talk about horror, it definitely is a universal genre, and that the fear towards the unknown, that's is shared horror for anyone across culture. And then what is more specific, it is what type of the unknown that scares people from Asia, from China, and more than American an audience, right? So that's the question I think is fascinating. And for like, particularly for like personally for me, because of we have very rich like ghost stories and folklores, and when we friends get together, the horror film we talk about that mainly about like ghost and supernatural, and so that type of, because we are like, personally for me, it is I also kind of believe in supernatural forces. So because of that, so that type of stories and films really scared me compared to slasher movies. Well, and also interesting is some themes in Asian countries that's very different from the themes that will scare, interest people relate to American audience. For example, I'm thinking about the South Korean horror film, Death Bell. So the Death Bell is basically a low-budget film. It's really talking about set in high school. So it's talking about high school kids and about the and it's explored the theme of the students have the high pressure of the going to college and the entrance, the exam, the examination that to get them towards the college. So they have the pressure, and the parents also have the pressure. So so that horror film particularly related to a lot of teenager and high school, middle school, and students. So it was such a success with a young generation. So that kind of theme, and in terms of United States, I mean, students in high school and middle school, they do, I mean, face the challenges, but it's, the pressure is definitely not the same as in Asian countries. And so the Death Bell, it speaks to us and more than speaking to my students. So I do show Death Bell to my students just to see the reaction. So through that, they learn more about the Asian culture, and then to see why this type of horror scare us rather than them. So that's just some of the examples.
You're making reference to pop culture. If we look at horror as a subset of pop culture being this wonderful venue to learn about other cultures. One of my favorite anime is Mushishi, and it's the quietest anime ever, and it's nothing but Japanese folklore ghost stories, and it's haunting as hell. And it's stories that we don't tend to hear these kind of stories, because the Mushi aren't ghosts. They're just a form of life in between dead and life. And the stories that they're riffing on those are fantastic. And you learn something about kami and such when you watch Mushi. So absolutely.
Yeah, no, this idea of a film is a product of its culture, and the audience comes to that film with their own cultural experiences, not just geographically, but also in period of time, right?
Yes.
So whether I'm teaching a film that's international or I'm teaching a US film, I always like to try and talk to the students and say, okay, this is what it would have been like to see it at this time, right? This is what was going on.
Yeah.
So you know that, but also then compare it to your reactions to it in this day and age, right? I mean, it's a different way of thinking about the multi-layered nature of film consumption. And I love the point that Lee made also about comparing the different themes of ghost stories and how they change, you know, Most cultures have ghosts, but they manifest differently.
Yeah.
We were talking about that on the way up too, that I read a chapter of a book on zombie films and showed that zombie films do very well in cultures where the primary mode of burial is burying one's body, but in the cultures where cremation is the modus operandi, they just don't do as well because the
No
concept-
zombies.
Exactly.
No bodies.
Yeah. Lots of cultures have vampires. They don't call them vampires. Some of them drink blood. Some of them drink life essence. Some of them do it from the neck. Some of them do it from the feet. All sorts of things, right? But anyway, we can talk more about that later. Scott, I want to, as a cognitive scientist and philosopher, what do you see as being sort of an interesting function that horror plays?
Well, as you said, that horror or any pop culture is probably the culture it's embedded in. And what I want to talk about is systems horror. In other words, people becoming terrorized by systems. And I just briefly want to do a little history of where we are in the United States with systems horror. So Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I think that's 56. The invasion is fairly Lovecraftian, right? It's something from outer space that comes to Earth, and it's going to take us over as individuals, and eventually take over the culture, and we're going to lose our humanity. And at that time, the system we were scared of was communism, right? So the system we're scared of is the evil othering system is still outside of us. It's not in us, it's still out there. And that's how a lot of horror tended to be up until the last 20 years, right? There's an evil other out there pursuing us as individuals. If you could go to the next slide. Then what you start seeing is, you can say is RoboCop sci-fi, is it horror? But when the tech world really starts to have a major impact on the way we think about ourselves, there's genre crossing going there, because there's horror in RoboCop, and the idea is the evil othering system is inside of our culture, right? Whereas in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it was outside of our culture, whatever that meant. Now, when you get the tech, now it's inside of our culture. If you go to the next slide, and then you see existence, where now that evil other that's in our culture is actually now under our own skin. And then once it gets under our own skin, we lose track of what's reality. And that's basically, it's body horror, Cronenberg, right? But it's also, and to the end, if you've watched the movie, they don't know where they are. They don't know where reality is at the end, because the corrupting other is now part of what they are, right? If we can go to the next. Here's another example of the corporate other, right? Resident Evil starts off as a game, starts off as wonderful, I'm gonna say, wonderful Beast movie series that I absolutely love. And, you know, the Umbrella Corporation is the evil othering system. It's inside our culture, under our skin, and literally changing what we are. And so what you see is horror reflecting an increasing cultural concern that we can't be clear who we are, and we can't be clear who the other is, and it's in a sense everywhere. And then, go to the next slide, please. Then we start to see that we are inside of the evil othering system, right? So all along, you know, when Lovecraft was writing, sitting in a position to be able to look out into the cosmos for the evil other, there were people living lives that were very much compromised by those who had time to sit around and think about cosmic forces coming to invade the planet, right? So what you see then is, as underrepresented groups in this country have, first of all, let's make it clear, attained more power to create the kind of stories they want to tell. Well, of course, those things that have been ignored are going to come to the screen. And Jordan Peele's basically been leading the charge in this front. So you see Get Out. If you go to the next one, Us is another, I would call it rather poetic horror movie. It's not the kind of movie you watch and there's a linear plot and you put it all together, and I actually prefer that kind of horror because it gives you something to talk about like forever, right? And you just talk about it forever. And what you're doing when you're talking is examining that evil othering system that other people have to survive. And if you go to the next. And then this series, which came out actually in 2001,
we are inside of the evil othering system. And these are examples. The thing is, this is not outer space. This is the life, this is the world they live in. So Lovecraftian's malevolent outer space system is now in the system we live in. If you could go to the next slide. And then Lovecraft Country really turns Lovecraft on its head completely. It explicitly takes the genre of looking for the evil othering in the cosmos and uses Lovecraft's very tropes to reappropriate what the other is and then show them, no, you looked at the way we've been living for decades, if not centuries, and we don't have to look far for evil. Fear's got no reason to travel. It's right here. And then I recently read this book, this graphic novel, After the Rain. It's adopted from a story by Nede Okofor, and it was adopted by John Jennings, illustrated by David Braun. And this is a graphic novel just coming out recently on Amazon about a Nigerian-American woman who leaves the United States and goes to Nigeria and has this authentic Nigerian cultural, spiritual experience that is very much not how we talk about spirits in the United States. We talk about binary spirits, heaven and hell, right? Other cultures have a whole plethora of spirits that are everywhere. Kami are everywhere, right? And their intentions and their emotions are quite diverse. So when she goes, I'm not going to spoil anything because it's a wonderful story. What I will tell you is it allows us to see what we think fear is. We think fear is something to avoid, and in this story, fear is something you must engage in order to become more complete. And so I'll leave it at that, and I just love this trend in what I'll call systems horror, and I can't wait to see what happens with it in the future. That's it.
Mic drop.
Oh!
I mean, no, there's so much there. And this idea of confronting fear and horror and making it, complete. I mean, there have been some people, theorists, and as well as researchers, who have looked at horror as being a way of dealing with our own traumas, whether those they directly connect to the horror that we're watching, or it's a little bit more metaphoric.
Right.
But I mean, documentaries of lots of famous horror actors. Heather Langenkamp, who was Nancy in Nightmare on Elm Street, did this documentary called I Am Nancy, which interviews a lot of her fans who used her character's strength and development arc to deal with their own personal traumas and struggles. Jamie Lee Curtis has told similar stories about how her character of Laurie Strode has affected audiences. So anyway, that's
I think, and I'm not an expert in indigenous horror, I do think when you're a group whose livelihood is persistently at risk, right? It's a group of people sitting around a campfire. Their lives are much more at risk, and there's a much more it affords a much more communal experience of the self. When you see industrialized and Western worlds emerge, and the risk goes down for most on a daily basis, then there it becomes increasingly individualistic. It's I save my soul, not the community's soul. We don't even talk about communities having souls, right? And I personally find it very satisfying that we are about everything. So I'm extremely delighted that idea is starting to permeate into our culture in ways that might help us deal with some of the horrors that our culture is currently facing.
got a lot of notes there, Lee.
Yeah, I think both of you covered a lot. Very important kind of perspective of horror I have been also thinking about. I think, Scott, you also, particularly mentioned one point is the historical reference in the horror. A lot of times people ask me, say, why do you like horror? And I get this question also a lot from colleagues, and they say like, horror is basically it's about violence, and it's about torturing women, and it's this sexist genre. And so they said, why do you like it? So I think like Scott mentions, there's one thing is, a lot of people consider it's kind of fantastic genre, the fantasy about how to oppress women and oppress the so-called the other. But on the other hand, I feel like a lot of horror films are very realistic, and they actually touches upon the real issues like we live with, and also just like you talk about the 1950s invasion of body snatchers, and what that reflects at that time what the public was, scared about. That's that's communism, and that's the whole political culture at that time. And also, Eric, you also mentioned the trauma. The trauma is not just the, so we have the psychological trauma, personal trauma, but there is also social trauma and historical trauma. And Scott, the films you mentioned, I'm glad you bring out that Get Out and Us, and also of course the new 2021 Candyman. So I noticed that there's very interesting rise in terms of black horror, and those horror films really address the historical trauma of the slavery. And so I just find that those films are not just considered a fantastic genre. They are trying to using this format, but really touches on realistic issues. And as you say, those kind of films, and we after watching it, we talk about that. There's so many things to talk about. That is also make that type of films fascinating. So it's not simply about violence. It's not simply about oppressing women. And then there are a lot of actually talking about another interesting thing about horror is there are more films horror films made by women filmmakers. And like one of my favorite horror films in the last 10 years, that a girl walks home alone. So that is a new take of a vampire. It's a female vampire, and so that's really gave a lot of power to women. So it's connect with more with the female audience. So I just want to extend about that.
Well, all these groups that were being oppressed and didn't have the power, the means to create their own stories, now they are. And they own their trauma now, right? And these stories are ways of sharing with the world what it means to be us, right? And I think that's nothing but healthy. We live in a democracy, which means everybody's had the right to tell their story, right? And invasion of the body snatchers, you gotta go looking for the other somewhere else, because the only people making movies are the white people who own the studios telling white stories, and the white fear was being white in a different way, right? So I just love this increasing diversification of the stories we see, and I would predict that as we see more of those, we're gonna see more indigenous type horror, where being fearful, having fear be part of what you are is not something to avoid, but something to embrace, because it allows you to confront the ugly things in the world when they happen instead.
Well, we got about 15 minutes left, so I want to.
I didn't know that.
I want to open up the questions to the audience. If you don't have any, I'm sure we can still find things to ramble about. But please.
And feel free to start with your favorite horror movie, favorite horror memory, and then we'll go from there. Come on, it's not that early on a Saturday. Yeah, please.
I'm happy to start. So you talked about systems horror, which I thought was a really tremendously interesting sort of tactful way to approach it. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the corporate horror, or some things you're seeing with people who, like myself, have sort of grown up in working in a series of corporate environments, or we're seeing more, now people are seeing more work from home, sort of work-life balance, but for a long time, the 80s, 90s, corporations sort of ran their life in many ways and in many cultures.
Wow. Well, if my kids have heard me tell corporate horror stories their entire lives, growing up in the 60s in a union town, Aurora, Illinois, we had General Electric, we had Barbara Green, we had Caterpillar, Middle class was pulling down $17.50 an hour straight out of high school in '77. I gotta say that again, $17.50 an hour straight out of high school in '77 is probably 80 grand a year to start now. The middle class got its piece, and that's because of the union systems. You don't want to hear my litany of the demise of the middle class as a function of corporate greed. Trickle down doesn't work. What it led to was more legislation affording those who have money opportunity to have more of it. And there is real horror that I've not seen yet, but I suspect in the next, we will see the horror stories of what's happened to the middle class. Now we're talking about science in corporations with Resident Evil. But we're starting to get to the point where we're recognizing that January 6th is a horror story that begins with the deregulation of the financial system, right? And the fact that people could radically change an individual's life by firing 10,000 people at a factory because they want to take that work overseas. We don't talk about that as a horror story. But if you're living that life and suddenly you've got both your parents got to go work, which didn't have to happen in the 70s, but both parents got to work security jobs to make half or 80% of what you made by yourself, that's a horror story. And we're seeing the long-term consequences. January 6th for me is a symptom of this 50-year reorganization of wealth in this country. So yes, I'll say one other thing if I can to shut up. There's a fantastic documentary called The Corporation. It's probably 15 years old. And what they do is they pull out the DSM, which is a diagnostic statistic manual that psychologists use to diagnose people. And one of the diagnoses is antisocial personality disorder. And they look at the symptoms and they ask themselves the extent to which corporations are actually expressing these symptoms. And the obvious answer is yes, right? When you can do things that toxify people's world and there's no individual in charge, and the only sanctioning you can get is cash. You can't get your pound of flesh. All you can get is, they don't care. I mean, they lose some cash, but it's different. So there will be horror stories about the world the middle class has been living in for the past 50 years.
I like the point that you make about the DSM bit. Related to antisocial personality disorder is some researchers in personality have looked at more sort of basic traits that correlate with antisocial behavior, and it was really called the dark triad. Now it's the dark quad. They keep adding, right? Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and then one of the big ones is psychopathy, right? And when they look at sort of base rates of these traits, they find that people who are very successful in business and who are very successful in politics are very high in these traits, particularly psychopathy.
Yeah.
Do with that what you may.
We've created a culture that provides selective advantage to those who are willing to cause massive harm at the press of a button. Right? And the thing is, the harm is never something they see. The harm is always at a distance, right? If you ever want to understand American psychopathy, watch Deadwood. HBO's Deadwood from the early 2000s, and you'll understand what a real sociopath is. It's not the person that's going to shoot you right here. It's the person who's going to kill your livelihood and your family from 200, 300 miles away. And that's the kind of world we're living in. And that story's not being told at the moment. It will be. Yeah.
The only film I think that's a great question because most of I'm just thinking about when I'm just going through the film list, like I selected for my class for this semester, I don't think that the selection actually have the setting in terms of the corporate. The only thing I'm actually thinking is American Psycho. Would that considered
Yes.
as a horror? So
that was a direct assault on Reagan.
Yeah.
Pretty direct. Soylent Green was their people. I mean, that's all our corporate,
There's another movie, I want to say it's director Larry Cohen, but The Stuff was another low budget type of Soylent Green type thing.
Yeah.
Has anybody seen Parts the Clonus Horror? So you may have seen the Ewan McGregor film. It was billed like a Michael Bay action film.
The Island?
The Island, yes. That was a remake of parts of the Clonus horror, right? And for those who haven't seen either, the general idea is that clones are being made to be organ farms for rich people, and the clones don't know that until one sort of becomes aware and tries to escape. And I mean, Clonus was very low budget, but there were some honestly chilling moments in that.
Yeah.
Especially when he no spoilers.
No spoilers.
Go see it.
War is another movie that is where the corporation was really the villain in the story. But that was when I watched it initially, I was reminded of the original Frankenstein story.
Yeah.
But because you're dealing with artificial intelligence, but it's really, I think, even though the actual child is the villain in the movie, it's the corporation that's really pulling puppet strings. So
You might want to even call it corporate goth, right?
Yeah.
In other words, because Frankenstein's about man's assumption that I'm being sexist, that's the language of the Gothic, right? Is that we believe we know everything, and therefore in our arrogance, we go into the world of nature and try to create. The creation is not the villain, it's Victor von Frankenstein. So corporate goth, that'd be a good name. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Why is Alien your favorite movie?
I mean, with like Halloween, Friday the 13th, even Nightmare on Elm Street, like the villain is still like recognizably human, whereas in Alien, the villain is alien.
Now, there's a
Freudian imagery.
the worst bodily invasion of spiders ever, right? I mean, so Ridley Scott, Guillermo del Toro, they're all highly influenced by Lovecraft's At the Mountain of Madness. And what Guillermo del Toro wanted to make At the Mountains of Madness, but once he saw Alien, said, well, Ridley did it, so I'm not gonna. The thing, I'll just point out a quick difference, because I've written about this and I love it, is that in At the Mountains of Madness, the Miskatonic University sets out an expedition to the South Pole, and they run into this extraterrestrial, ancient aliens place, and there are two creatures they run into. One are the elders, who are the cosmic and colonizers who do this, and the other is these creatures called Shoggoth, who are these huge subway-sized black amoeba-type creatures that were created by the elders to do slave labor. And all I'll say is at the end of At the Mountains of Madness, the northeastern scholarly geologist ends up identifying with the colonizing elders. And the Shoggoth, the slave labor, they're to be. So what I've not seen Ridley do with Aliens yet is show some love for the aliens, right? I mean, they're just doing their thing. And there was one line where Sigourney Weaver says to Paul Reiser, you don't see them screwing each other over for a profit. That was the one line where there was any empathy to be had with what some would argue the aliens are Ridley Shoggoth, right? So I would love to see the aliens genre move a little away from the abject other notion of the alien and actually find, I don't want to say empathy, but find a way to make us think about who we're hating and not why we're hating.
So there's the corporate horror angle there too, because across all of the films, and I don't know if you've been reading the Alien comics that Marvel's been putting out, they're actually very, very good. I mean, it's just it's the company, why Weyland-Yutani just group after group of people just throwing them out there here. and I do recommend reading the new Alien series if you're into that, because it's definitely corporate cyber goth horror.
Exactly.
So we've got just a few minutes left. So what I want to do is give my panelists a chance to tell you a little bit about where you can find them online, as well as maybe plug some events. in the organization of these slides, I went first. So, it's moderated. So you can find me online at Illinois State University's Department of Psychology webpage.
Awesome.
Department of Psychology's webpage. You can also find me on the Twitter at Eric Wesselmann. I do a lot of work with our local town-run historic theater called the Normal Theater. So I do a film blog called Film Culture, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I do want to plug an event. How many of you know The Room? All right, excellent. So Greg Sestero, who was one of the co-stars of The Room and wrote the book The Disaster Artist, is going to be in Bloomington Normal Friday, September 30th to do a double feature of The Room. Crowd participation is recommended, so bring your plastic spoons. And his new horror film, Miracle Valley. So you can go to their website and you can purchase tickets. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks those will be open. I am teaching an honors course this semester for 8 weeks, which is a partnership between our honors program at ISU and the Normal Theater called Understanding Horror. So I'm teaching in my class on Tuesday nights, and on Thursday nights we're having film screenings that's open to the public. So if any of these films interest you, only 45 minutes up the road, you can scan the QR code there and that'll take you to Normal Theater's website. Lee, you were talking about
if you have any questions, and contact me. It's easy to find my name on the Illinois State University. Just if you forget my name, just type film studies. It's because I'm the head of the film and digital media program. So that's what gets me. I already talked about I'm teaching horror this semester, and if you're interested in what films I'm teaching, I will be happy to share with you. Candyman is actually Eric and I, we will both attend Candyman conference, actually the whole conference, 2 days, and devoted to discussion about Candyman. Not just necessarily the 2021, but from the 1992 Candyman, the original, and then the sequels, and then there's a new production. So both of us will talk about that, and this is a QR code. If you scan, you can find more information about the conference, right? And also about our information, right?
Yeah, and then the conference is completely virtual, right?
Yeah,
so
it's
you all
virtual.
can attend and watch Lee's talk, my talk. You can watch interviews with Tony Todd when they happen. So.
Yeah, and Bernard Rose, he's the director for the original 1992 Candyman film.
All right.
So at Illinois State University, I co-organized a little thing called ReggieCon. What it is a virtual Zoom panel we do once a month where we celebrate the History Heritage Month being celebrated nationally with panel discussion of usually a graphic novel. So if you're interested, I have these I can hand out to you later. And on the back, there's a QR code that will take you to the webpage for ReggieCon. It's absolutely free. We've had Chris Claremont, David Mack, Emil Ferris. If you're into graphic novels, you know that these are names. And we have a crew called the ReggieCon crew. It includes myself, Eric, Mr. Victor Daniels Jr., and Dr. Vanessa Hintz, where we're there every time so we can get a little community, across these things. We're hoping to be able to do a live con out at ISU in April. You'll hear more about that if that is actually able to come to fruition. So,
And all the old panels are archived, right?
Yeah, so when you go to the webpage on the QR code, you can scroll down and you'll have access to, through YouTube, right, all the panels that we've done so far. And they're a lot of fun. And then in my spare time, I do a little YouTube channel myself called Dark Loops Productions. What I do is usually use pop culture to talk about psychology, philosophy, science, the humanities, and lived life. I think, as you probably sensed in my talk, quite often in academia we leave lived life on the curve as we get abstract. And for me, it's always got to start with human experience. What it feels like to be a human being, and then the abstractions should come from there. So I get nerds like us together and we talk about all the, like for example, we just finished and I'll be posting later today the final episode of Westworld Season 4. And so I put together different crews for these things. We have fun, so it's not an analytic conversation, right? We have fun, but we do try to bring our expertise to bear. And we have a lot of fun. Thank you. That QR code will take you to the page.
And in addition to, for example, the ReggieCon postcards, we've all put various different flyers and things out there on the table outside. Feel free to take. We'll be hanging around out there after this and wandering around the con. So thank you all for your time. Thanks to Brian and the rest of the con crew, everybody who's making things happen behind the scenes. Production's a lot of work, and so if you see the people working in different spots, do please thank them for giving us this nice time.